Welcome to Dialing In Your Coffee Business, where we help cafe and roastery owners build a healthy coffee business that takes great care of people, including them. I'm Michael Ryan. I'm a certified business coach and consultant that helps cafe and roastery owners build a healthy coffee business that takes great care of people, including them. On today's episode, we're discussing emotional overload. Emotional overload is a foundational framework that we teach our one-on-one clients, and it is one of the most life-changing frameworks that we discuss. A foundational framework, as you may recall from our previous episodes, is a term that we use to describe mental models or mental maps. These are natural laws. In short, these are the accurate and useful ways of understanding how the world works. We often have underlying assumptions, we all have them, about how the world works. And the question is, are they accurate? Are they true? And even more importantly, are they useful? Today's mental model, today's mental map is emotional overload. And like a map, an actual map, it's not going to be 100% perfect, 100% accurate. It's going to be accurate enough to help you navigate from point A to point B. And here's what I mean. If you are traveling a great distance and you're using, say, Google Maps on your phone, if you look at the actual map, it is not actually 100% accurate. There would be too much information in that map to be useful in navigating from point A to point B. So as we discuss emotional overload, we're going to talk in broad brushstrokes, things that are generally true for how the human brain is wired and how we may or may not get emotionally overloaded. And my hope in explaining it in a slightly simplified way is to be more helpful, for it to be more useful. So if you know anything about emotional overload or about neuroanatomy, you may find yourself thinking, that's not the whole story. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Yes, absolutely. My hope in this episode is to simplify it a little bit so that it is in fact more useful. So what is emotional overload? Well, it actually goes by many names. Dr. Daniel Goldman refers to it as an amygdala hijacking in his books on emotional intelligence. Dr. Dan Siegel refers to it as being emotionally flipped. And Dr. Faith G. Harper has a profanity-filled explanation that I find hilarious and helpful. And if profanity does not offend you, I would encourage you to look at Dr. Faith G. Harper's work. But emotional overload refers to essentially the state our brain drops into when we are experiencing either so much sensory input or so much emotional input that our critical brain, our thinking brain, our neocortex, our prefrontal cortex actually deactivates and goes offline. So emotional overload, in a nutshell, is when our thinking brain, if you will, or our neocortex or prefrontal cortex deactivates and goes offline. Indeed, in fMRI machines, that region of our brain actually goes dark, meaning there is minimal to no activity when we are emotionally overloaded or emotionally flipped. So that's what it means. That's what the word means. We're going to walk you through what it looks like, a little bit more of an understanding of how this is actually the brain's default mode. This is not the exception. This is actually the rule for humanity. A little bit about how this affects our decision-making, especially as business owners. A little bit more about how stress plays into this, how easily we get emotionally overloaded, and then some action steps and some results you can look for in your own personal life. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that this podcast is an extension of our coaching and consulting. It's a part of our effort to make all of the tools necessary to build a healthy coffee business zero cost to everyone. In keeping with that theme, I'd like to thank one of today's sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by our How to Start a Cafe online on-demand course. If you've ever dreamed of opening up a coffee shop, this 12-module course will take all the guesswork out of the process. The course is taught by Maxwell Mooney, and he distills everything he learned from opening up multiple coffee shops into this course. You can access this course and all of our other on-demand courses at threadbarecoffeeconsulting.com/courses. As a listener of the podcast, you get a unique discount code, so be sure to enter the code podcast100, all caps, to get $100 off your online course. That's threadbarecoffeeconsulting.com/courses, and enter the code podcast100 to get $100 off any of our online courses. So what is emotional overload? Again, this is a mental map. This is a foundational framework that is a mental map. So my main goal in sharing this with you is not to be 100% perfectly accurate, but to be very, very helpful, very, very useful, and accurate enough towards that end. So again, if you find yourself saying there's more to it than that, or it's more complicated than that, I absolutely agree. My hope is to make it simple so that it can be useful, just like a map is simple so that it is useful. I've shared this framework with hundreds of people, many of them business owners, some of them just people that I've mentored over the years, friends in passing, and it's incredibly powerful. Over and over again, when I share this framework with people, they say things like, my entire life makes sense up until this point. This helps kind of snap into focus a lot of the experiences we have, both personally and as an industry and as a culture. This is a very powerful framework, and I'm very excited to share it with you because my guess, even though I don't know you personally, is that it will actually explain a lot of the things you've experienced that were confusing before, and now you'll be able to see them more clearly. They'll sort of snap into focus, like I said, and you'll understand why those things happened the way they happened. There's a big mindset shift or a paradigm shift inside of this concept, and I'm going to share it with you now, and then we're going to revisit it very shortly. But the mindset shift or the paradigm shift is this. We generally think of ourselves as intellectual beings making rational decisions. And in fact, the opposite is true. We are not intellectual beings making rational decisions. We are emotional beings making irrational decisions. That is much more accurate, it's much more true, and it is much more useful. You just have to be around other people to see that this is true. Again, foundational frameworks are self-evident, meaning you just have to pay attention and you'll see that this is accurate. I was working with a client and they were generally very reasonable people, but they happened to get attacked on social media by a former employee, and the entire team, owners and staff included, just wanted to get even with that former employee. They wanted to strike back. They wanted to lash out. And these are generally, reasonable, kind, good people, and yet they behaved like children throwing a temper tantrum. Why would they do that? It's because of emotional overload. It's because of this idea of getting emotionally flipped. Now, if you think of yourself as somebody who is more logical than emotional, I'm not at all diminishing that or denigrating or taking that away. This is to go alongside and to inform and better explain some of the things you might be experiencing from an emotional standpoint. We will also discuss action steps and results you can look for as we dive into this. We're going to look at how this is the default way of the human brain. We're going to look at how this affects our decisions, and we're going to look at how stress affects whether or not we get emotionally flipped or emotionally overloaded, whether or not we have acute or chronic stress, and if it changes the way we respond emotionally to situations. The mental model I want to share with you today that will give you something to grab a hold of is from the work of Dr. Dan Siegel. Dr. Dan Siegel is the one who created what he calls the hand model of the brain. The hand model of the brain, or more specifically, the hand model of the head brain, is using the human hand. And if you're watching this on YouTube, you'll be able to see me do this. But if you're just listening, you can do this along with me. If you take one of your hands, it doesn't matter which one, and hold it up to yourself, palm facing you. If you tuck your thumb across your palm and then wrap your four fingers around your thumb, this is a surprisingly accurate model of how the brain works. This is neuroanatomy in a nutshell. If you hold up your hand to your face, it actually looks a little bit like a human brain. But it's not 100% accurate. This is not your brain. I don't mean that, obviously, but it is useful in understanding what's happening with your brain. So if this is the hand model of the brain, your wrist would be your brain stem or your spinal cord. The base of your palm would be the brain stem. Your thumb represents your limbic system, amygdala, hippocampus, that kind of thing. And then your fingers wrapped around it represent your neocortex. And then so your prefrontal cortex would be these knuckles right here, your two middle fingers. So this is a great representation. This is a mental model of the human brain. A really good way of understanding emotional overload is by holding up your hand and thinking of what it feels like to get emotionally overloaded. And essentially your thinking brain, your neocortex, your prefrontal cortex goes offline. And in Dr. Dan Siegel's mental model, he flips the four fingers straight up to represent that the emotional brain has taken over and the thinking brain, if you will, is offline. So the brain is overloaded. The thinking brain is offline. The emotional brain has taken over. Yeah. So I'm breaking the brain into emotional and thinking brain. Is it more complicated than that? Of course it is. But again, I'm trying to be helpful and trying to create something that is useful. But we actually have phrases for this experience. I'm calling it emotional overload. Dr. Dan Siegel is calling it emotionally flipped. Dr. Daniel Goldman calls it amygdala hijacking. But we have phrases for this in the English language when we say things like, I got so upset, I flipped my lid. I got so upset, I lost my head. I got so upset, I forgot myself and behaved in a way that I would never normally behave. These are all phrases to describe what it feels like to get emotionally overloaded or emotionally flipped. Essentially, it feels like the emotional brain takes over and the thinking brain goes offline. And in fact, this is what happens. Again, in fMRI machines, in real time, we can see brain activity. And what we see is the thinking parts of the brain, those associated with critical thinking, with consequence prediction and language, go offline and they go dark in an fMRI machine. This is really powerful. This also speaks to another reality that's helpful to understand. And this is, again, a little bit of neuroanatomy, but it's helpful to think of our emotions and our critical thinking and our words as coming from different parts of the human brain. Now, it's not that simple, but it's also close. It's close enough to be helpful. It's accurate enough to be useful. It's helpful to think of your emotions and your words as coming from different parts of your brain. And if you're using the hand model of the head brain, emotions are coming from the base, where your thumb is, amygdala, hippocampus, that kind of thing. And the words are coming from your neocortex, your prefrontal cortex, that kind of thing. Is it more complicated than that? Yes. But we're trying to come up with something that is simple and useful. So generally, when we say something like a person is in touch with their emotions, we're often articulating that there can be a gap between the emotional brain and the thinking brain that produces words. There can be a gap, and a person who is in touch with their emotions is adept at bridging that gap. They can put words to what they're feeling, and those words are articulate and accurate. So somebody who's not in touch with their emotions would say something like, I'm not angry. When everybody around them is like, you're clearly angry, they would say, I'm not stressed. And everybody around them is like, no, you're very obviously stressed. You're just unaware of it. That's kind of one end of the extreme. A person who's in touch with their emotions would be able to say, I'm very upset right now for these reasons. And when we demonstrate a tremendous amount of emotional health or emotional intelligence, we're actually able to express the emotion with words instead of with behaviors and actions. For example, I can say I'm angry and upset instead of punching a hole in the wall. I can say I'm hungry instead of getting really irritable and short with people. So the reason this is a foundational framework is because it is the brain's default. Even though I don't know you, I can say with relative certainty that this is the way your brain works, because this is the way all human brain works. All human brains work. Part of the reason that this is true universally is because if you just think developmentally, when a baby is born, their emotions manifest first, and words and critical thinking develop after. We have emotions and we express those emotions pretty much at birth. A crying baby is a classic example. The thinking brain, if you will, does not finish developing until about age 25. Age 25 is actually the average. There are some studies that suggest it's quite a bit longer for males than it is for females, ranging from age 23 to age 29. Regardless, generally accepted neuroscience principles is that the thinking brain, the critical thinking brain, does not finish developing until about age 25. This is a little bit funny because if you think about insurance companies, insurance companies have known this for much longer than the rest of us, because you can't rent a car until you're age 25. insurance rates change when you're age 25, 26. It's very fascinating that it seems like insurance companies have figured this out, and yet most of us aren't thinking about it. But regardless of the specific age, the point is developmentally, emotions come first and the thinking brain comes after that. If you just use the age 25, it can be pretty easy to see that if you live to 100, the first quarter of your life is kind of ruled by emotions more than critical thinking. And so to say that this is the default of the human brain is very true and very useful, because your life up to this point, if you break it up into pre-25 and now whatever is after 25 for you, you'll realize that a big majority of it in number of years, but also those years come first. Those developmental years are largely ruled by our emotions. The paradigm shift here is to realize that we are hardwired to give our emotions the upper hand. So this is true developmentally. This is also true neurobiologically. If you track the path that sensory input takes through the brain, it passes through the emotional brain first. This is why I said earlier, we are not intellectual beings making rational choices, objectively thinking about things. We're actually mostly emotional beings making irrational choices, thinking mostly subjective about things. Again, you can track the path of sensory input through the human brain, and it essentially, depending on what type of sensory input it is, it either passes through the spinal cord and then the limbic system and then the thinking brain, meaning to say it goes through your emotions first. Your brain is hardwired to give your emotions the upper hand. Or if it's visual input, it passes through the back of the brain and then comes to the front of the brain. Now, being default emotionally driven sounds like a bad thing, but it is not. It's actually an incredibly adaptive behavior in general. Adaptive meaning it's good for our survival. If you think about a truck coming at you on a road, you don't pause and make a pros and cons list about getting out of the way of the truck or not getting out of the way of the truck. If you did that, if we were primarily intellectual thinking beings, we would actually not survive. We just get hit by that truck, and that's the end of the story. So it's actually a good thing that we're default emotional, because it gets us out of the way of the moving truck. It allows us to deactivate our thinking brain, get out of the way of the truck, and then pause and assess. So this is a good thing in general. This is important because most people do not think of themselves as default emotional beings making irrational decisions. Most people don't realize how easily they get flipped or emotionally overloaded. And especially business owners, they don't realize how many decisions they are making from an emotionally overloaded state. And there's one more thing that's worth noting, that emotional overload is contagious. If I get emotionally overloaded, I can transfer that to you through a video or through a podcast. Honestly, I can transfer it. If I'm emotionally overloaded, I can get you emotionally overloaded by leaving a comment on YouTube or on Instagram. We can overload each other, and it's not very difficult. So this is a helpful paradigm shift to think of ourselves not as intellectual beings making rational decisions and thinking objectively, but emotional beings making irrational choices and thinking primarily subjectively. Now, it is both and we'll get there in a second. But if you begin just by thinking and kind of experiencing this paradigm shift of we're not primarily intellectual, we're primarily emotional, or at least we are emotional first, it's much more accurate. It's also much more useful. If you think back to a lot of your experiences during the pandemic, if you just apply this foundational framework to what you experienced, a lot of what you experienced will make a ton more sense. What was everybody doing during the height of the pandemic? They were essentially running around with their thinking brain deactivated and their emotional brain taking over, their fight, flight, freeze response, if you will. And so a lot of what we experienced makes a lot more sense if you think of humans as primarily emotional, or at least emotional first. And if you think of humans as beings that can get easily emotionally overloaded so that their thinking brain kind of goes offline. My hope in covering this with you is that you begin to see that emotional overload is actually the default of the human brain. It gets us out of the way of the moving truck, or if you think back thousands and thousands of years, it gets us to run away from the saber-toothed tiger. We don't pause and think about it, we just do it. The whole don't think, just do mantra is tapping into this. Don't try to engage your rational brain, just engage your emotional brain. But it is both and ideally, and that's where I want to go next. We're talking about the default state of the human brain. I'd like to take a brief moment and thank another one of today's sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by our How to Start a Cafe group coaching cohort. This 12-week cohort is led by Maxwell Mooney, and he meets with the group weekly to walk you through the 12 modules that follow our online course, How to Start a Cafe. But it is much more than that. In addition to access to the course and the group coaching calls, you get access to our private Slack community, access to group call recordings, as well as a link to book one-on-one calls with us during your 12-week cohort. You can watch the full trailer for this group coaching program and all of our group coaching programs at threadbarecoffeeconsulting.com/group-coaching. And for our podcast listeners, be sure to enter the code podcast500 to get $500 off your 12-week cohort. That's threadbarecoffeeconsulting.com/group-coaching and enter the code podcast500, all caps, to get $500 off your 12-week cohort. Now let's talk about how we make decisions. This might be a hard pill to swallow, and I realize I'm not a neuroscientist, but it doesn't really matter because people who are not neuroscientists have understood this for thousands of years. Human beings are often thought of as broken up into two categories: emotional decision makers and logical decision makers. Neurobiologically, that's not accurate. That's a mental map that does not match the territory. We actually all make decisions emotionally, and some of us justify those decisions logically. We make them emotionally, and then we justify them with words after the fact or post hoc. The bullseye of the target, what we're aiming for, is both and, but we need to recognize that the default, again, if we don't intercede or interact, if we don't do something on purpose, the default of the human brain is to make decisions emotionally. Hundreds of years ago, Benjamin Franklin said, quote, "How convenient it is to be a reasonable creature." I'm sure he would have done air quotes if he was here with us today. How convenient it is to be a reasonable creature, since it enables one to make or find a reason for whatever one has a mind to do. Essentially, we use our thinking brain, we use our words to justify the thing we actually just wanted to do in the first place. Now, is it possible to weigh the pros and cons? Is it possible to make informed, critical decisions? Yes, absolutely, but it is not the brain's default. That's my point. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying you don't do it. I'm saying it's not the brain's default, and I'm saying a lot of what we think is rational thinking is just post hoc logical explanation for irrational thinking, because that is the human brain's default. Now, what we know from research is that when the emotional brain or the limbic system is damaged, we do lose our ability to make decisions. So that makes a ton of sense if you understand that the emotions are made, the decisions are made emotionally and then justified logically. So if I said, if somebody's emotional center of their brain got damaged, they would have a hard time or become actually unable to make decisions. If you think the human brain is primarily logical, rational, that wouldn't make any sense. But if you think of it as primarily emotional, then that makes perfect sense. Again, we're looking for a map that better matches the territory. We're looking for a mental model that actually articulates the way the world works. And this is much more accurate. It's much more true. It's much more useful. But emotions are not just a part of the process. They're the first part of the process. They're what comes first. They happen without our say-so, so to speak, and they're incredibly important. Again, people who lose or get their emotional brain damaged find themselves unable to make even the simplest decisions. So emotions are essential, but they can lead us astray if they go completely unchecked. So in a previous episode, we talked about false dichotomy and the false dichotomy framework and either or thinking. Generally, this is an example, and it generally gets presented as a false dichotomy. We have sayings like, don't follow your head, follow your heart. in that framing, it's either or thinking, and they're generally saying there's 100% your head, your intellect, your rational thinking, and there's 100% your emotions, your heart, and your irrational thinking. And it's either or. It's either 100% head or it's 100% heart. And in that mindset, don't follow your head, follow your heart. They're generally encouraging you to follow 100% your heart, 0% your head. And that is a false dichotomy. That's an either or frame that's not accurate. There's plenty of other options. And there's times when, frankly, you do want to let your brain be deactivated and just go with what feels right. But you can't do that all the time. That would be a maladaptive strategy. So in the example of the truck coming towards you, don't follow your head, follow your heart is great advice, right? But if it comes to, hey, should we grow our roastery or should we sell it off? Well, don't follow your head, follow your heart. That's terrible advice. The goal, the apex of the triangle, the middle option that's better than either extreme is a balance of both your head and your heart, recognizing that it's going to be your heart first. Your emotions are going to come into play first. And then you can layer on top of that critical thinking so that you make the most balanced, informed decision possible. But primarily, your brain is hardwired to give your emotions the upper hand. And if you're not paying attention, you'll get emotionally overloaded or emotionally flipped, and you won't even realize that you're making a critical business decision from an emotionally flipped space. I'd like to take a brief moment and thank another one of today's sponsors. Today's episode is brought to you by our one-on-one coaching program. Whether you're in the startup process or you've already opened up your cafe and roastery, our one-on-one coaching program is for people who are ready for a personalized touch and a proven process to follow. This 12-month program takes you through 3 major phases where we make sure you as the owner are flourishing, we make sure the business is flourishing, and finally we make sure the staff is flourishing. Not because staff is least important, but because this is the only process that actually works. When you join one-on-one coaching, you get access to all of our group coaching materials, including recordings and the private Slack community. In addition to that, you get a standing one-on-one meeting with us where we walk you through how to ensure that you are flourishing as the owner, how to ensure your business is flourishing, and of course, how to ensure your staff is flourishing. For one-on-one coaching, we prioritize people who have taken our courses and or joined our group coaching, but you can always reach out to us and schedule a strategy call so that we can be helpful and see if one-on-one coaching is a good fit for you. Just go to our website, threadbarecoffeeconsulting.com, and click the link to book a strategy call. So because this is the human brain's default, it affects how we make decisions. And there's one last piece of this that is worth planting the seed, and that's stress. We do not understand stress very well. And by that, I mean we have underlying assumptions. We have a mental model of what stress is that is neither true nor useful. First of all, stress is not good or bad. Stress, when we use that word, we're generally thinking of negative things, but stress is not good or bad. Again, that's either or thinking. That's a false dichotomy. Is stress good or bad? Neither, both at the same time. So there are 2 types of stress, and then there is the level of stress. Okay, so in brief terms, and again, if you know the stress research and you know Dr. Hans Selye and those folks, you'll again think that you'll be able to say this is a little bit too simple. Yes, correct. But it's more useful. There is acute and there's chronic stress. Acute meaning it's short and maybe relatively intense, but relatively short time frame. Seconds, minutes, maybe hours, but that's about where it cuts off. More in the seconds and minutes. Then there's chronic stress. So not seconds and minutes, but days, weeks, months, years. These are 2 very different things. So there's acute and there's chronic. That has to do with the timeline. But let's also talk about the intensity. A 10 out of 10 stress versus a 5 out of 10 stress versus a 1 out of 10 stress. So let's tackle them in reverse order real quick. It's very helpful to think of stress in terms of on a scale of 1 to 10. If you are experiencing literally 0 stress, that's actually not a good thing. Because if you experience literally 0 stress, you won't get out of bed in the morning. The brain sends a signal to secrete a fair amount of cortisol, which is often thought of as the stress hormone, first thing in the morning to get you up and out of bed. It's not a bad thing. Also, stress that creates growth and has a positive impact, also called eustress versus distress. Eustress is like going to the gym and working out your muscles. That's positive stress because it's at a level that the body can handle that yields growth. So stress is neither good nor bad. It's both, but it's possible for it to be framed as either end of the spectrum. And we might think that zero stress is good. Zero stress is actually bad. 10 out of 10 stress is also bad. Operating more in the middle space where we go between like a 3 and a 7 and then back to a 3, that's much more adaptive. That's much more useful. That would be considered eustress. That's a stress that is positive and yields growth. So that's stress on a continuum from 1 to 10. Then there is acute stress and chronic stress. This is more of a time question. So I've talked about intensity. Now we're talking about time. The human brain and the human body is very good at dealing with acute stress. Going back to the example of the truck coming at you, you jump out of the way. You've got all sorts of stress hormones pumping through, adrenaline, noradrenaline, cortisol, those kind of things pumping through your system, and it causes you to jump out of the way of the oncoming truck. And then you probably have a little bit of shock maybe, and then you slowly come back down and return to baseline. That's acute stress. It's measured in seconds and minutes. We are really good at dealing with acute stress, and we are really terrible at dealing with chronic stress. Acute stress is, going back thousands of years, being chased in a jungle by a tiger. That would be an acute stress situation. It's only going to last for a couple seconds or a couple minutes, and then it's going to be over one way or another. In the world we live in today, we are primarily dealing with chronic stress. We're not being chased around by a tiger anymore in the jungle. We're being chased around by an email we read in our mind for days and weeks and months and years even. The human brain and the human body are not suited to dealing with that type of chronic stress. It wears on us, and it actually will shorten our lifespan over time. So stress is neither good nor bad. You don't want 0 and you don't want 10 out of 10. And it is also can be broken up into acute and chronic stress. Acute stress is short-lived, generally speaking, and chronic is more permanent. The reason this is important is because the level of stress in our life affects how quickly, how easily we get emotionally overloaded. So somebody who has dealt with moderate amounts of stress, and it's been an amount that allows them to grow each time they experience it, that is incredibly powerful, but it also leads to an emotional state that is a little bit more difficult to overload. If you go back to the emotionally flipped hand model of the brain, you can think of it as these 4 fingers that are wrapped around your thumb. Those 4 fingers are stronger, if you will. The muscles in those 4 fingers are stronger, so it's more difficult to get flipped for that type of person. Unfortunately, we live in a world today where chronic stress is more the norm. And so a helpful way of thinking about that is these 4 fingers, the muscles in those 4 fingers are exhausted from just constant stress. And so they're weaker in the sense of they're exhausted, they're fatigued. And so we get overloaded and emotionally flipped much more easily. A person's experience in the past can lead to this happening, or it honestly doesn't take very long before we get overwhelmed or just tired. And if we start to experience chronic stress, and chronic stress honestly can be just a few hours. Oftentimes it's days, weeks, months, and years. But if you ever had an impending decision weighing on you for a few hours, you might find that you are irritable and more easily emotionally overloaded at the end of those few hours. It really does not take very long. Again, this is not because you are weak or you are emotionally volatile. This is because the human brain is not very good at managing stress over a long period of time. It's much more suited for short bouts of acute stress. This, I hope, is helpful because it'll explain a lot of what you're probably experiencing, especially as a business owner. Most cafe and roastery owners deal with chronic stress, especially when the business kind of just feels like it's always about to fall apart. Think of that as basically permanently being on the edge of emotional overload at all times. That's so exhausting. And man, it can really affect your ability to make wise, informed decisions. You'll find that if you get into that space where you're too tired or you're dealing with chronic stress, you get emotionally overloaded a lot more quickly. And so in that state, your thinking brain goes offline and you start making emotional, irrational decisions instead of listening to both your heart and your head. You're primarily just listening to your heart. And in that space, it's not so much listening to your emotions, it's listening to your fight, flight, freeze response. You're more of your survival brain than your emotional, like heart brain. This is not new information, but this is a new way of explaining an ancient principle or a timeless principle or a first principle. When I say this is not new information, I mean people have been talking about this and writing about it for thousands of years, but a lot of this wisdom doesn't really get passed down to us. It's not part of, a standard public school curriculum or even a private school. It's not really passed along, even though it's incredibly useful and incredibly helpful. But just to give you a sense of how long people have been talking about this, Aristotle said, anyone can become angry. That is easy. But to be angry with the right person, to the right degree, at the right time, and for the right purpose, and in the right way, this is not easy. That mentality of getting emotionally overloaded is actually the brain's default. It's the human brain's default. And it's easy to get angry. That would be the emotional overload or emotionally flipped state of just being angry. But to be angry at the right person, to the right degree, in the right time, for the right purpose, that requires the thinking brain to kind of come back online, so to speak. And for us to be able to say, yes, I'm angry, but is this the right person? Is this the right degree? Is this the right time? Is this the right purpose? And am I doing it in the right way? Those things require critical thinking and the critical thinking brain to come back online. Rudyard Kipling said, if you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, then what? Yours is the world and everything in it. The whole idea is that we get easily overloaded or easily emotionally flipped. Again, Dr. Daniel Goleman calls it amygdala hijacking. Dr. Dan Siegel calls it emotionally flipped. Dr. Faith G. Harper and her work, she uses a lot of profanity to describe it, but the principle is the same. It's really easy to get angry. It's really easy for people to lose their minds or lose their head, as Rudyard Kipling said, and even blame you. But if you can keep your head, if you can stay in a space, or even if you do get emotionally flipped or emotionally overloaded, to come back to baseline more quickly than you used to, or more quickly than other people around you, these are powerful skills to learn. And as Rudyard Kipling said, yours is the world and everything in it. There's a fantastic book called Critical Conversations. And one of the things that they observe is that if you do need to have a critical conversation, the moment, they call it psychological safety, I believe, the moment that safety is lost, the conversation has to stop and it cannot move forward until safety is restored. I would say it slightly differently. The moment somebody gets emotionally overloaded or emotionally flipped, the conversation must stop, and you cannot move forward in the critical conversation until one or both parties come back down to baseline. By now, I hope you are beginning to be aware of this concept of emotional overload, understanding that it's actually the human brain's default, understanding that it affects our decision-making as business owners, and understanding that stress, both acute and chronic, affects how easily or how frequently we get emotionally overloaded. I hope you are more aware at the end of today's conversation. But this is a foundational framework, meaning that it is self-evident. It has always been true. It will always be true. And all you need to do next, if you're on the fence about this, is pay attention. Pay attention to yourself and to others. With all foundational frameworks, I never recommend going straight after other people in your life. I recommend starting with yourself, cultivating self-awareness, paying attention to yourself so that you can then take constructive action. One of the most powerful tools for taking constructive action when you find yourself getting emotionally flipped or emotionally overloaded, or you just realize I totally am emotionally overloaded. I have been for minutes, months, days, weeks. One of the best things you can do is what's called a physiological sigh. A physiological sigh is an activity that resets the human brain. In the hand model of the head brain, it would bring your four fingers back down over your thumb, over your thinking brain will come back down over your emotional brain. And it's a way of resetting your parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system balance. The parasympathetic nervous system is sort of like the brake in a car, the brake pad in a car, the brake pedal, in a car. The sympathetic is poorly named because it's really more of the gas pedal. It's the thing that ramps you up. The brake pedal is the one that brings you back down. So physiological sigh is 2 inhales, a long deep one in the belly, and then a short one to top it off. And then a sigh where we verbalize and we engage the rest of our body. And so it sounds and looks something like this. Now, one physiological sigh is enough to change your brain state and bring you back down from being emotionally flipped. 5 to 6 is even better. Research shows that the chemicals in our system don't actually stick around that long after we get emotionally overloaded or emotionally flipped. The number specifically varies from source to source, but it is much shorter than I thought personally. One expert even says that the cortisol and the adrenaline don't stay present in our system for more than 60 seconds. So you may get emotionally overloaded and your brain and your body may secrete a ton of adrenaline, cortisol, that kind of stuff. But after about 60 seconds, it becomes a choice to remain emotionally flipped. So you may not have chosen to get emotionally flipped, but you can choose whether or not you stay emotionally overloaded, emotionally flipped. And the physiological sigh is one of the best real-time tools to take action in the moment when you find yourself getting overloaded or you find yourself already overloaded and you need to come back down. There's things you can do before and after, things that decrease your overall stress or eliminate chronic stress. But you will not be able to eliminate all stress from your life. And in fact, you wouldn't want to. You're not going to be able to do that. So don't even try. Also, you wouldn't want to because then you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning. So there's going to be some stress and you can do work to try and eliminate some of the chronic stressors, but you're still going to experience acute stress. And a great way to come back down from that is the physiological sigh. 2 breaths in and then a sigh out. When we begin to pay attention to this particular foundational framework, you will more quickly recognize when you are personally emotionally overloaded. And I hope in the way I've shared it with you today, that it does not bring about feelings of guilt or shame or judgment. I hope. That's not the heart at all. The hope is to recognize this is actually the default for all humans. So if you find yourself getting flipped or emotionally overloaded, that's okay. That's kind of the way the brain's supposed to work. It's an adaptive behavior that we've developed. So there's no guilt, shame, or judgment. You don't need to judge yourself, but you are going to want to learn how to come back down. Likewise, you will recognize when other people are overloaded. And if you think about how we tend to deal with people who are emotionally overloaded, we often berate them or tell them to suck it up or calm down, but their thinking brain is offline. They're not going to respond to those kind of things. Oftentimes, the best thing we can do is we do a physiological sigh kind of on their behalf. We don't tell them to do it. We just do it because getting overloaded is contagious, but also calming ourselves down is contagious. So it can be a powerful thing to recognize in ourselves. It's also powerful to recognize in other people and develop the skills to bring ourselves back down. The person who gets overloaded less often and comes back down more quickly, that's, I think, what Rudyard Kipling was referring to when he said, the world is yours and everything in it. If you get overloaded less often, and when you do get overloaded, you come back more quickly, you can, I think, pretty clearly see that that is much more helpful. It's much more useful. It's much more adaptive than getting overloaded all the time and having such a hard time coming back down. Now, if you get overloaded on a frequent basis, if you have a hard time coming back down, that makes total sense. That is how the human brain's wired. That's the default. Unless we learn this skill unless we learn to do something about it. It's not to say that if you get overloaded often or struggle to come back down when you do get overloaded, that you're somehow less than. That's actually the norm in my experience and also based on the research. That's the norm. That's how the human brain's wired. The point is not to demonize that or denigrate that. Also, for most of you, nobody has ever told you this stuff before. Most of us didn't grow up being taught these kind of foundational frameworks. So for the first time, maybe in your whole life, somebody is explaining neuroscience in a nutshell in a way that makes your emotional responses to the world make sense. But perhaps nobody's ever taught you this stuff before. So how could you possibly have the tools up till now? The hope, though, is to share these tools with you and show you that, yes, it's understandable that we get overloaded. Yes, it's understandable that we have a hard time coming back down. We all do. I do. But wouldn't it be better if we learned how to get overloaded less often? And when we do, because we will, come back more quickly. Wouldn't that be better? I think it's a very clear yes. The question is just, how do we do it? And how do we avoid judging ourselves and being hard on ourselves? But also, how do we avoid falling into justification because things are hard? Yes, things are hard. Yes, we get overloaded. But it's not going to be super helpful to get stuck on that when we could be learning how to do a better job with avoiding emotional overload in the first place, or returning to baseline as quickly as possible when we do get overloaded. Thank you so much for joining me today for my conversation on emotional overload. If you're enjoying this podcast, please consider subscribing on YouTube. That's a great zero-cost way to support this podcast. In addition, please subscribe to the podcast on Apple and Spotify. And on both Spotify and Apple, you can leave us up to a 5-star review. Please check out our online courses, our group coaching, and our one-on-one coaching. That's the absolute best way to support this podcast. If you have any questions or topics you'd like us to cover or guests you'd like us to invite, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. If you're not already following us on social media, we are at Threadbare Coffee Consulting on Instagram, and that's really the only platform we're active on. That's where I regularly post bite-sized thoughts on what it will take you, the owner, to build a healthy coffee business that takes great care of people, including you. The content we post on Instagram overlaps with the podcast, but it's generally distinct from anything we cover on this podcast. If you haven't already visited our website, we have a myriad of free tools and trainings for coffee shop and coffee roastery owners. Everything from calculating your cost of goods sold for both a cafe and a roastery, which is completely different, pricing, which again for a cafe and roastery is completely different, managing labor percentage in a way that takes great care of people, etc., etc. All of those tools and trainings are available at our website, threadbarecoffeeconsulting.com. Thank you so much for joining us for today's episode. And last but not least, thank you for your interest in building a healthy coffee business that takes great care of people, including you.